All right. Oh, people are already filtering in. Welcome, everybody. Grab a seat or stand. I don't know. People like standing desks.
Oh,
Have you ever had
really?
a Have you had a standing desk?
I'm an exercise ball person, but like my exercise ball broke, so I'm on my partner's desk chair. So, like, I hate it so much. I like need to get back to something that is like less ugly and more like mobile.
I love that. I mean, people have real opinions, and I think it can change. Like, I love my like one of those Aeron Flux chairs. I
Mm.
love it. I had like a hard chair for a long time. And then my now husband was like, "What are you doing? Can I order you this chair?" And I was like, "Yes, absolutely. If you'd like to buy me he's my boyfriend at the time. And I was like, "Buy me a chair. I'll take an office chair." But it's funny. And I would never stand. Like, I can't stand in work. I wish I could.
Yeah.
I mean, and then with the moving desks, I mean, my desk is full of goodies, so I think the moving desk, my stuff would fall everywhere. So you just have a flat surface because you just have the round ball.
Well, yeah, but I also wanted a particular aesthetic. So I have a glass desk with copper legs, which was very hard to come by. So they're like, oh, you could have a moving desk. And I'm like, but it's ugly. Like, why can we not have things that are functional and also pretty?
I mean, Kate, you and I are on the same page. I mean, my desk is from reclaimed wood. It's all reclaimed wood made in, North Carolina in the United States. And I love it. I'm like, I want something pretty. My
Yeah.
only regret is it's not long enough. I made it a little, you got to like design it. And I'm
Oh,
like,
wow.
it's a little too short. I wish I had, or a little too, like not depth, not enough depth. That's what I'm trying to say.
Mm,
The length is great. The depth is a little bit off, but I like pretty things too. Not that
yeah.
there's anything wrong with moving desks or practical desks, but it is fun to see how people organize themselves at work.
Yeah. I have a strong opinion on how the aesthetic of my office should be. I just want it to be, yeah, I want it to feel like a creative, inspired, like cozy, beautiful space. So, yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah, my vibe is like, me too. Mine is like modern beachy or like
Mm,
urban beachy, I should say. It's like
hmm.
urban beachy, crystals and plants and, but I live in the middle of New York City. So, all right,
Amazing.
fantastic. All right. We're not going to talk about offices the whole time, I promise. It looks like we've got a good amount of folks. So let's get started. So thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club, and our sessions cover an array of engineering and leadership books that our awesome Lead Dev audience can draw insights and practical experiences from. I'm Susan Bond, and I'm the moderator of Bookmarked. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup, um, a leadership consultant, and the founder of Constellary. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me everywhere on the internet at Susan Bond, LinkedIn, and all those other places. Today, we'll be talking about The Engineering Leader Strategies for Scaling Teams and Yourself by Cate Huston, who obviously I've been talking to. It's worth mentioning that Cate is doing an ebook giveaway. So look out for an email from the lead dev team shortly to opt into the prize. You're going to want this book. So if you have questions for Cate, please pop them in the Q&A feature, and I'll be sure to take care of them. So just a little bit about Cate. Cate is an engineering director at DuckDuckGo, an advisor at Glowforge and Twill, and also a coactive trained leadership coach. Cate is the author of Engineering Leader and can be found at cate.blog. Welcome to Bookmarked, Cate.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited. I saw you at Leading Edge London, and I said, "Oh my gosh, we have to have this book." And I'm so grateful that you agreed to come talk about it. So I guess the first thing I'd love to start with is just like, what made you write this book? What was sort of the impetus?
Yeah, I mean, so I always wrote a lot. It was really my way to like process things. It's like a form of deliberate practice, right? It's something that makes you better at whatever it is you're trying to do. And eventually I felt like I had a book-sized message. And I really like writing blog posts. I'm not sure if I like giving talks, although I think I like having done it after it's done. But there's something about like if you write a blog post, then you have to have a pretty like concrete message to give to people, right? And if you give a talk, you can take people on like more of a narrative journey. But actually, in some ways, I think you can always cover less content in a talk because people will take away like one idea, right? If you're lucky and you can really nail the idea that you're giving them. And so like a book is really, it's a longer journey to take people on. And so I finally felt like I had that journey that I wanted to take people on, that I thought would, I really started with this idea of like, so few of us in tech actually know what a good manager looks like. And like, that's the journey I want to take people on of like, how do you figure out what that is and what it looks like for you as a leader, whether or not you're like just managing yourself and maybe like, I don't know, when I was the tech lead, some people thought I was their manager just because their manager was so bad. Like maybe that's the situation you're in. Maybe you're just like managing yourself, or maybe you are like managing a large org, and like having that idea of like, what am I going towards? I think it's really important because so few of us do. And then we're anchored on like, oh, this guy, he was a really bad manager. I'm not like him. Cool. Like that doesn't actually get you very far.
Right. Okay, now what?
Sure. Like I've not made this basic mistake. Congratulations.
Oh, that's great. I mean, I listen, the book is chock full for everyone who hasn't read it yet. It's really chock full of great advice. I really encourage you to read it. We're going to talk it because it is so chock full. I've picked out a few things that I'd love to talk to Cate about today. So, but do go check out the book. So I want to start with time management, right? We talk a lot about time management, but what I love that you talk about in the book is energy management, especially for those who are in management roles. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what do you mean by energy management? And first, let's just talk about that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think like when you're an IC, when you're like writing code, like time management is a differentiator for you. If you're like very good at time management, you are just able to get more done, right? And when you're a leader, like getting more done at some point, like doesn't really matter, right? Other people are doing stuff. And actually, the thing that matters much more is like, are you getting the most important thing done, right? And often that's kind of a horrendous task, right? And so, one of my directs once told me that they thought my job was arguing with people, and I was like, oh shit. And it's not arguing with people all the time, like for sure, but like, maybe in a given week, there's the argument I need to have, right? And like actually getting through that argument is like a huge energy management issue. Because if I come to that argument tired, or I come to that argument like grumpy, then I'm just going to be less effective at it. And so like actually the like biggest thing that I can do for my team that week, I'm either going to do badly or I'm going to avoid it because it's just going to be so exhausting, right? And this is like this is kind of this trap I would see in like new managers is that they would show up just like exhausted trying to do everything for their team, and they're not doing the thing that is actually most important, that really moves the needle. They're like, oh, it's my job to like be useful to my team, it's my job to like help them and do all this stuff. And then at some point they just can't help them anymore because they're like reactive and exhausted and whatever. And if they can figure out their own emotional energy, they'll be so much more effective, right?
Mm-hmm. It is because there is different energy that we have to manage, right? It's not just physical energy, time, it's emotional, it's mental. And I would say emotional and mental. I mean, we do talk a lot about how leaders' calendars are packed, but the emotional and mental energy that is needed is tremendous
Yeah.
that
I mean,
to
then
do
I
the
would say
role.
make your calendar less packed. Like, what are the
Right.
boring meetings? Delete them. Like, my goal right now is to only go to spicy meetings. Like, if I'm not there to like have an argument, like, why am I in this meeting at all? Right. I mean, except for one-on-ones, right? But then it's like, and I would notice that when I start having
Mm.
time to like manage my energy and think critically, I just mindlessly agree to go to meetings without thinking about them. And I don't necessarily like have the capacity to have the right conversation. you know I did this experiment one week where I was like I carved out like 15 minutes to think about every meeting before I went to it, and I was like, oh wow, all these meetings can be better, but only if I preserve the like not just the time but also the energy to think about how to make them better.
I love that. I love that. Is there anything else people who are in management or leadership roles should consider about energy management we haven't talked about yet?
I think the big thing is like people management problems can be really draining. If you think about the worst parts of people management, like obviously performance management, but even like when you just have somebody who like you care about and it's kind of your job to care about them and they're just going through something difficult, like that is so emotionally draining. And like if you don't give yourself space for that, then you're going to do a less job at like meeting whatever that person needs from you.
Hmm. Yeah, and it is such a huge shift to sort of point out too about like, if when we're in IC, the mental and emotional output is just different than when you're a
Mm-hmm.
manager, right? It's really so different. And even recognizing that they're different, I think can be perhaps helpful for people.
Totally. I think about what I did for fun before I was a manager, and it was like so different. I used to organize things for fun, and now I'm like, oh my God, I'm never doing that again.
Right, right. Like, what does organizing people take? A lot of energy, like around,
Totally. Totally. I used to think group exercise classes were fun when I spent so much time alone. And now I'm like, oh my God, nothing would induce me. Like Peloton at home by myself, being alone. Like this is, like it's wild.
yeah. Reading a book. Mine is like a favorite, like, when I was really heavy into management, it was like being at home alone. I would schedule me time in. I remember on my calendar at nights, I would schedule it in. I would go home and read a book. And it was the most giving thing to just sort of balance that out.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
hear you. I would never group or organize a group thing at this point again, like if I'm doing those kind of roles. Well, so you kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there is this trap about being useful. Right. I
Yeah.
think managers sometimes can fall into this trap of like trying to be useful. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what that trap is, because you talk about it in the book so great. And how does it get in the way of the work of
Yeah.
actually leading?
I mean, the metaphor I use in the book is the idea of like when you go to a nice restaurant, there's the person who's front of house and they're like making sure that everything is seamless. But like it kind of looks like they're doing nothing. It's like that guy's just standing around in a nice suit. Like, what's his job, right? Why isn't he more
Gives it
useful?
gives a menu every once in a while.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that's kind of, if you're used to like your value being like doing, feeling like you're kind of observing and like being still feels like useless. You're like, oh, I could just do this thing for this person. I could just do this thing for this person. And then I'm not saying never do that because like nobody wants to be the kind of manager who seems like they're above the work of their team, right? But at the same time, if you give all your energy to trying to be useful, then there's parts of your job that you're not doing because you just don't have capacity to notice what's actually going on.
What are the parts of the job that you think when people are trying to be useful, what are the parts of the job you think that they end up like not doing or having capacity to do?
So I'd say the emotionally hard things, right? And
Mm.
two, being strategic.
Yep. 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 Agreed. I was curious what you would say. I think I see that too, right? Like the conversations that they had, the hard conversations get stretched out. They linger and linger. I know I've coached someone and they said, like, when did this begin? 6 months ago. How many conversations have you had? Zero? Okay. You're at step one, right?
Right. And I'm sure that every week for the last 6 months, they had a good reason of why they weren't doing it.
Right. Right.
And I like really notice for myself, like sometimes I'm like, oh, what is my job again? What do I need to do? And like, I always at that point need to step away from the computer. I need to go for a walk. I need to get on the spin bike. And then it comes to me, I'm like, oh, here is the most important thing. And then I'll like sit down and like write a document or I will have a difficult conversation. But like, I feel like I find the most important parts of my job when I think I've like, air quotes, run out of things to do. I've never run out of things to do.
Oh, I love that. That's a really great example. I see those both when I work with leaders too. So I want to take us in a little bit of a different path, but I want to talk about how when we get further and further into leadership, we get less explicit feedback, which means we need
Mm-hmm.
to look for the explicit kind. So I'm wondering if you can talk just a little bit more, help define like what do we mean by implicit feedback, and then how
Mm-hmm.
people can recognize and surface it.
Yeah, this is honestly an interview question I love to ask when I'm interviewing a leader. I'm like, tell me about some
Mm.
implicit feedback. Okay, so my canonical example with implicit feedback is that you think you've done a great job communicating the strategy of your team, and then you're like in a skip one-on-one or something, and it's clear that somebody doesn't understand the strategy. that is implicit feedback for how you've communicated it or how much you've communicated it. And so that's always like my biggest example. But I think there are like other things, like if you have somebody and you think they're high potential, but they're not growing, well, like that is implicit feedback on how you're managing them.
Well, right. And I think sometimes what happens is, and no shade on us, we've all done it as leaders, like, oh, they didn't get it. They didn't get the message, rather than like seeing, oh, that's actually a message for you, because your job is to make sure that somebody gets the message and understands the strategy.
Yeah, no, totally. But like it might be that they didn't get it. Like, who's gonna make that difference? It's not them, it's you.
Right. Yeah, it's on you. They didn't get it. It doesn't mean whatever. But I mean, sometimes, and well-meaning leaders, I'll hear that, and I'm like, yes, and it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, your job is to make sure they get that message and that they understand it and they know how to move forward on it. And we don't see that as, I think a lot of leaders will say, I'm not getting enough feedback, but they don't recognize it's all the implicit, because they think someone's going to sit down and say, now, Cate, I have some feedback for you, and here's point A, B, and C, and here's how you're going to improve. And I'm like, that,
Oh, it's
I
not,
don't
it's
know.
not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But also, by the way, if they did, there's no way they would have context of my job. And so they would tell me something that was like manifestly nonsense, right? Like it would be like, you should have been doing like this, that, and the other. It's like, okay, cool. Like you don't realize that I'm performance managing the person who's supposed to be doing that, or something, you know, like no, if nobody has context on your job, no one can give you good feedback. You have to stop expecting it and start like triangulating it and being like, okay, all right, this was obviously not clear. This is obviously not going well. I staffed it. That's my responsibility. What should I have done better? And one of the things I like to do with my directors, if something doesn't go to plan, is to like talk to them about it and be like, okay, we made this decision and we kind of thought that it might go this way and it did. So I'm not super worried about that one. But we made this decision thinking it would be okay and it wasn't. So like, what should we learn from here? Like, how can we make it differently? What can we take from these two situations and say, like, what's similar between them? Like, what can we do differently next time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, so what are some, what are some specific way people are like, okay, I heard your examples. How do I tune my listening for implicit feedback? Like how, I don't know if you were always good at it, or if you know what I mean? You trained yourself to be a little bit better at it.
Yeah. I think I'll give you like an example that I talked to a couple of people about recently is, and a couple of my directs being like, you know, this person is just like saying they don't find value in my one-on-one. So like, what do I do with them? And I was like, okay, look, you don't have to meet with this person to think about them. I know this guy doesn't like to talk to people, but I think about him on a regular basis. And I'm like, what kind of opportunities does he need? What is he doing really well? Like what? Should we like take off his plate? And so I think like that kind of for me is an example of like somebody might tell you what they want, but it doesn't mean they're telling you what you should do, you know?
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of subtlety in implicit feedback. And really, like, I don't know about you, but as a coach, I always say I listen with every part of my body, like my fingers, my
Mm-hmm.
toes, my hair. And it's really about deep listening and deeply paying attention. And that feedback is all around you if you really pay attention.
Yeah, well, you have to notice what's not being said to you, right?
Yep.
And so that's like, I think a concrete question that you can sometimes ask yourself is like, okay, what did I expect here versus what happened? Like that's what you'll find. If you just start asking that question every time there's a difference between your expectations and reality, like that will take you step one to the implicit feedback. And then to come back to my example, sometimes it's like, what is the deeper thing that I could do with this explicit feedback?
I love that. Yeah, I think that's really powerful. I hear that the feedback thing, I hear it all the time, and I hope that people will read that section of the book, because there's some really good stuff there that will help
Mm-hmm.
folks. Well, so, and on a similar line, but slightly different, which is like, so what happens as we get further into management and leadership? There's just less career maps, expectations. There's just a lot less of those things
Mm-hmm.
happening.
Mm-hmm.
How do you figure out how to be your own manager when no one's telling you what to do? And maybe you even have a career map, but no one's really telling you.
Yeah. I mean, I talk about this in the book, these like different things that you like ideally get from your manager, right? So direction, support, context, and practical help, right? And so then I think you have to be realistic about like what you're going to actually get from the manager you have and what you're going to get elsewhere. And then if you're filling in these four things, like, I don't know, my manager is great for context. I try not to ask him for support, but when I do, he delivers it because like it's not often. So he knows if I'm like, I just like need you to help me, then it's like I'm having a really bad day. Practical help, I would never dream of asking him for. He'd probably say that I should sometimes, but then again, it's like the bar for it is really high, right? And then direction is like critically important for me to get from him, right? So then I want to spend the majority of our one-on-ones on what's the direction, what's the context, and then the other two things I don't really want to ask from him, for him. And then I spend my hour with him really well, right? But I think sometimes for ICs, because they are kind of more narrowly focused, right? They end up spending their one-on-one on like support and practical help. And like this is totally fine. But at some point, you know, if you want to get the most out of the time you have with your manager, you want to shift it towards the context and the direction. And that means your other needs are going to need to be met elsewhere.
Yeah, and can you talk a little bit about just support and practical help, just to define for people what those look like? Because I think we understand
Yeah.
direction and context, but the other two could maybe, just to make sure we're all clear.
Sure. I guess support I kind of think about as like a little bit like emotional support, like something's hard, or you're just feeling a bit like lost. And then practical help is like uh moving stuff along for you. Right?
Yeah.
Like I sometimes describe my job as like curling. I just like go around sweeping for people so that they can move faster. Right. So like the sweeping is a little bit like practical help, you know?
I used to live in Minnesota for a little bit, so and curling is very big in Minnesota. So love that. Exactly. It's like sweeping things out of the way, preparing the path forward, obstacles. Great. Those are really four really great expectations of what we should get and hopefully provide for people, and also
Right.
recognizing maybe where we are best in those as a manager or leader.
Yeah, and when you need to augment your people, like I tell all of my directs to get a coach. And sometimes we come to something and I'm like, what a fantastic topic for your coach. Like, good luck with that. It's not gonna happen yet.
Well, right. Like I also think sometimes we expect our managers or leaders, like our boss, to give us everything. I'm like, they can't. Our boss will never be able to give us everything, no
Right.
matter where you are in the, you know what I mean,
Exactly.
on the
Exactly.
career ladder. They're not going to.
Yeah. I remember like telling somebody this and then being like horrified of like, why are you managing somebody if you can't give them everything you need? And I'm like, because I give them this thing that's critically important. And these are all things that they can get elsewhere. And by the way, a lot of the things that I would offload either were opportunities, sometimes opportunities for other people, you know, and sometimes it's just like you know this as a coach, right? And I feel like my value as a coach is I'm just like I'm here for you. I'm here to be your like number one fan and like help you succeed. And I do not care about the organization you work for. Like that's not what I'm here for. But like when I'm being a manager, it's like I can try to bring some of that mindset. I can bring some of those toolings, but like ultimately I live under capitalism. This is my job. I represent the organization, right? And so if you want somebody who's just going to be neutral and like purely on your side, like go and have a coach. I want everybody to have that, but I can't give it to everybody at work.
Right, right. Yeah. I think it's really good. I hadn't planned on talking about that, but I think it's really good to sort of think about what are those things you need and how do you get them from other places. I think we'll all be happier and more well supported. Think too, like having that neutral perspective, whether it's an external coach or somebody else inside the organization, sometimes an external perspective, a neutral one, can give you so much when you're like
Mm-hmm.
confused about something or how do I move forward? Getting that perspective can help pull you away from.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I
Oh,
mean, that's your work friend. I want everybody to have a work friend too, but like there's some boundaries there about like this would be a good work friend for you. You can't set people up on play dates. Um, but yeah, like I mean, I would be lost without my work friends, you know, and I'm just like, oh, what do I do with this? You know, I'm like, okay, here's something I want to talk about. You know, I got this feedback. I'm trying to like slice through it. I noticed this thing. Like, how can you do you have context that will help me make sense of it?
yeah, I think it's so great. And I mean, I think underneath this too, one thing that's really true is that as a leader, you will fail. You
Mm-hmm.
You will fail at some point. And one of the things I really loved about this book was you talked about identifying your failure mode as a leader.
Mm,
It's maybe slightly different, but it's so important because it does reinforce we'll fail. And the importance of understanding our personal mode, like when are we
mm.
maybe more prone to it. So I'm curious, if you could talk about some of the ways people might identify theirs.
Yeah, I think it's like if you make a mistake, what's likely to drive it? Like, are you avoidant? You didn't have the card conversation. Do you like take too much on for everybody else and you get emotionally lost? Are you like a little controlling? And when you get overwhelmed, you start trying to control things that you can't control? I love the PQ model for this because it really kind of tells you like when you're stressed, what is the instinct that will take over to try and protect you? And that instinct like often that instinct comes from a good place, but when it's overused, it's bad.
Mm-hmm. Wait, and I'm trying to remember. So you talked about in that section, I know you talked about Strengths Finder, which,
Mm-hmm.
as I understand, I'm a big fan. I used to work for Gallup. I'm a sort of a trained strengths coach. I use it a lot. It's like one of the best assessments. But you also is the PQ the one that identifies is that the saboteur one?
Yeah, the saboteur one. Yeah, I love
Yeah,
that.
I
And it's
did
so,
that. I
yeah.
actually did that one. I was like, I did it. I was like, I'm gonna go do this and see what I am.
What did you learn?
So I was not surprised. I was high on hyper competence or
Mm.
what's it called?
Hyperachiever.
Hyperachiever. I'm like, I always call myself a recovering perfectionist, so no shock. And I always say like I hit a goal or I die trying and I'm still here yet.
Yeah.
No
Are you
shock.
a
I was also
recovering perfectionist or are you just still in it?
I'm working on it. I'm always
Okay.
going to be in
You're
recovery. That's that.
an aspiring recovering perfectionist. That's
Yeah,
funny.
yeah, yeah. It's better than it used to be. But I also got hyper vigilant. And then
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to remember, and there's some of the ones that were at the bottom, like control. I was like, yeah, I know I'm not a control, I'm not a stickler.
Yeah.
But it was really great. It actually opened up something when I did it. I thought, oh, yeah, maybe I'm hard on myself even as a business owner, and maybe I need to I need to like shift some things. It was really helpful. I highly recommend folks take it. It's a free assessment you can take.
Yeah, it's so helpful. It's so helpful. It's good as a coaching tool to like neutralize it, So it's not like you're controlling, it's like your controller is, and like that just separates it a little bit. But like the hypervigilant, I think is a great example of something that is a strength, but overused will just like emotionally DOS you, right? One feedback that one of my peers at my last job once gave me is he was like, Cate, I think I can look ahead, but it's like you can look around corners. Like this is 100% the hypervigilant thing. I can like see things, I can pick up patterns, I like have a sense of what's coming. But then if I am like strung out, if I start overusing that, then every new piece of information feels like a catastrophe. And like, guess what? Then I can't make decisions.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I think a lot of that section for me, what I love about this like idea of failure mode, and it's what I talk about. I talk about this too. So when I read that, I was like, oh yes, kindred spirit is like, my dad always says your assets in excess become your liabilities. When we do something too much, when we go over, it's about
Mm,
balance. And it's not
mm,
about whichever the ones that I had, whatever the saboteurs that I had, but it's about
mm,
how am I in balance and how do I recognize maybe when
mm,
I'm on an edge with it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm sure a lot of your accomplishments are like the hyperachiever is a product of being driven, right? And then I'm sure you value about yourself that you're driven. And you're like, the thing about the hyperachiever is it makes us afraid that if we stopped listening to it, we would fail. Like that bit's the con, right? It's like, one
Yep.
of the things that I was talking about with one of my coaching clients recently is like, look, your saboteurs are in the car with you. They get to give you information, but you do not give them the wheel.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I'll just say this too is fascinating. Once I did it, I told my husband, and I don't know what he said, and he was like, I think most people see you as very successful. And I was like, they do. And he was like, okay, there's your result right there. I was like surprised. I was like, he's like, you've been a COO? I was like, oh, Okay, but it was really funny so we can see them. So it was really great. Even though I've done a lot of these things, I actually really loved that one. I've seen a ton of these. I don't always find them useful, to be frank.
Mhm.
I found this one useful and I really highly recommend folks because I think sometimes as leaders, we don't realize our impact is huge. And so if we don't
Mm.
recognize when we're in that failure mode or when we're out of balance, the impact we can have on other people.
Right, because this is something else that Shazad Kami talks about in the positive intelligence model is like when you're in your saboteur mode, you invite everybody else into their saboteur mode. So then it's like it's not just that the saboteurs are driving your car, it's you're on a highway. Everyone's saboteurs are driving the car, and then you end up in a pileup, right? Like it's just bad. So, if you can kind of get back to this place of calm, it's like, oh, it's interesting. Like I see, like this saboteur is here taking them under advisement.
Yeah, that's great. I love that imagery of the highway. Okay, so I want to move on to something sort of different. Now, we've all heard this, right? That leaders or managers will say, like, come to me with solutions, right? Rather than problems. But what I loved is you said you welcome complaints from the team. You don't actually have that philosophy about come to me with solutions, not problems. I wanted to hear more about why, what's the value of hearing those complaints?
Yeah, I guess I always wonder when people say that, and I'm like, are you getting good solutions?
Mm.
Because I am very skeptical. Like a lot of the solutions I get are not very good. And then you start asking, like, why do you think that this is a good idea? Well, like, that's when you're going to learn a bunch of stuff. And then that's how you can get to a better solution that kind of, like the kind of failure mode of bad solutions is like, I want this process to make people behave a certain way. Okay, well, why is that important to you? Like what is this like stopping or enabling? And like that kind of process often ends up feeling like way too heavy-handed too, right? And so if you
Mm.
understand, like, you can't get everybody on the same page until you know like what page they're on.
Mm.
And like where do you get more information than the stuff that people are actually moved to come to you and complain about?
Hmm. Yeah, right. So then it's like I hear like it's like you're taking a pulse check and gathering more information in in hearing those complaints.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not like taking a commitment to solve everybody's problem. But but I
Duly
am like,
noted.
yeah, I am just kind of like, I would like to know what people think the problems are. And then, the solutions, like whatever, maybe they're going to be responsible for it. Maybe it's my job, right? Like, because this is another
Yeah.
place where like what people complain about is often like a form of implicit feedback for you.
Well, and I don't know about you, but one of the things I spend a lot of time with leaders is helping them identify. So they're experiencing a problem. Is the problem me or is it something organizationally? And
Mm,
sometimes, because right, sometimes when there's an organizational problem, I'm like, the good news, it's not you. The bad news is it's not you, which means you may not be able to solve it, because it's
mm-hmm,
a much wider, but I think
mm-hmm.
sometimes we don't know that. So if we're coming with a solution, sometimes there are org problems that are above our area of
Yeah, yeah.
influence too.
Yeah, I mean that's totally true. I guess I probably come to it a different way, but end up in the same place because sometimes I'm
Hmm.
like, are you gonna play the game that's on, or are you gonna play a different game? And like, I'm definitely like, look, in my core, I am a burn it to the ground person. I'm like, let's start everything again, abolish capitalism, right? Like this is who I am at my center. But like, I'm not making progress on that day in, day out. Sometimes it's like, all right, there are places where I can make progress on making a new game. And there are places where it's just like, look, this is the game that's on, feel however you feel about it. But like, if you want to be effective, you have to operate in the way that the organization says you need to operate. And actually, only by operating in that way can you have the power to affect change.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's kind of a similar, we come at it slightly differently, but it's sort of like a similar thing. I love that. I had not heard somebody say that before, and it really struck me. So I wanted to hear, I thought there was some great wisdom in why complaints aren't necessarily always a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. And I also wonder, it's like just because we get a complaint doesn't mean we're doing something wrong, or something bad has happened or that we failed.
Yeah, I mean, often it just means this is what this person cares about. What great
Yeah.
information.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. I just thought that mindset shift was so fantastic. Obviously, I'm a hyperachiever, so um, I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Failing, what's that? All right, I want to go on to a different topic, which is, so I hear from a lot of folks, I'm sure like you, they talk about how they want to improve their skill with, technical strategy. So I just want to let's talk about what does it mean to create technical strategy? Because I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
we always use the term in the same way in
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
world.
Yeah, I mean, strategy is my current obsession. I wrote about it a lot in the book, but I feel like if I ever write another book, it'll be like, really, like, what is strategy? How do you do it? So I think, like, I come back to good strategy, bad strategy a lot in the way that I think about strategy, and I
A
love
book.
that book
His
so much.
yeah, his what's his name?
Richard Rummel.
Yep, good strategy, bad strategy. Great book.
So good, so good. And there's so many, like I just have a blog post where I just pulled all the best quotes from that book. Like it's so good. But there's kind of a few things in there. Like one, good strategy seems obvious. And I think this is really critical. And two, I think I'm going to butcher his explanation of this, but it's basically that, you know, what people think is strategy is often kind of this like loud idea, we're doing
Right.
this. And actually, good strategy is only good if you can actually execute it. And this kind of act of being like, here's our end state, here are our approximate objectives, and here's how we're moving between them and learning from each one to move forward. That's strategy, right? And so if somebody comes to me and says, I want to be better at technical strategy, it's like, do you need to make people think you're better at technical strategy, or do you actually need to be better at technical strategy? Because I don't think these are really that much the same problem.
I know people say that because when we did the workshop, Supercharging Impact, people would say, "Oh, we're not going to cover strategy. I'm terrible at it." And often when we would peel it back, they had this misunderstanding of what it meant to be, what strategy meant, and they had these
Mm-hmm.
big ideas. It's a big roadmap and it's visionary, and it's like,
Yeah. Yeah, so okay, so I have some notes. So I've been thinking about strategy in this way, where
yeah,
I'm like, strategy is about having time for it, having context to make it, defining the proximate objectives, and having the expertise to chart the path, right? And so, like, this has become clearest to me when I think about the like most extreme version of each of these four things, right? When somebody's all time, we call that person a political operator. When somebody is all context, we say they can't see the forest for the trees. When somebody is all proximate objectives, we call that person a thought leader, and it's not a compliment. And when somebody is all expertise, we say this is a solution in search of a problem, right? So these are like the most extremes of all these cases. And this, I think, is a little bit how we like diminish stuff that is not strategy. And we say, like, I don't want to be political, so I'm not going to spend time selling my idea, right? Like, I am a leader. I don't get in the weeds. And so then we don't learn what's in the forest, right? Like, this is having depth. Like, how can you have strategy if you don't understand the problem you're trying to solve? We like, maybe the thought leader were like, oh, well, they had a good idea, but they couldn't execute it, right? And so then we don't focus on the execution, which is, by the way, how the strategy gets delivered.
yep.
And then expertise, I think, is just like, it's hard won, right? It's like, okay, you don't want a solution in search of a problem, but you better understand what the solution is, right? And so I think there's kind of there's these other like thing with strategy where people either are not communicating the work it is that they're doing, or they're so focused on communicating the work that they're doing, they don't actually have the depth to do it. And so I think this is my kind of current thinking about strategy is like, how do we like take these extremes and say, but this is what's useful from each of them? And how do I build the depth that I need? Right? How do I make the time or the energy to like make sure that people understand what I'm delivering? Right? How do I identify the steps towards something and like have a founded belief in what will work and why, and also understand why I need to learn each step?
Yeah, I mean, it's so useful. I feel like it's something that's talked a lot about, but also in some ways not enough or not in the right ways, technical strategy,
Yeah.
and so I think people will find that really valuable because it's something that comes up over and over and over again, and folks feel inept at it. In my experience, it comes
Yeah,
up
yeah.
all the time.
Right, right.
Yeah, I hope people got some good things out of that. I have two last questions. How, one quick suggestion on how people might get better at technical strategy?
Um, I mean, I guess it's to come to this, I'm going to write up this model, right? But then I think you need to figure out what is it that you need to get better at. Do you need
Yep.
to actually build more depth in order to have a better idea of your approximate objectives and how to execute on them? Or do you actually are you doing a good job at that already? And what you need to do is like explain your ideas better and kind of sell them more. Maybe you need to do all of those things, but I'm pretty sure you can like pick one or the other for it's your approximate objective to get better at strategy.
I love that. And you haven't written about this, is not in the book. So this is something that you're just sharing with us, right? You haven't written about this yet.
Yeah, this is my like new obsession.
Yeah, yeah. So this is something that other people have not heard before. So I'm very excited that we got to hear that, because that's a really interesting way to think about it. So I guess I just have time for one last question. So on a little bit on that note, a lot of folks wonder about being great at execution, but then they also want to make the leap to being seen as strategic, right? We're like, they're good at execution, but not strategy. There's like this feeling about that
Yeah. I mean,
sometimes.
who is good at
Yeah.
execution but not strategy?
Hmm.
Because I think this is something that happens particularly to women. Like I hear about it from women. I would not be surprised, like all these things, like we don't have data about what people of a color experience because there's just like not enough of them in the industry. But like my like first bet is that it's the same for women, right? Sometimes it's different, but you can start from there. So this is actually a way that under-indexed people get diminished and held back. And so like again, I'm a burn it to the ground person. I would like to change this game. But the reality is that we only advance by playing the game that's on. And so if we know in this situation the odds are kind of stacked against us, then we have to be more deliberate about how we approach it, right? So if you know that like it's way more likely somebody's going to take credit for your idea, you have to operate a bit more defensively. You have to make sure you have your receipts. This is why I love remote work. Everything's in writing. I have all my receipts. It is so much harder for somebody to take credit for like what I've done than it was when I worked in an office.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great. It's like acknowledging the reality and then trying to do some small ways to shift that perception.
We don't like change the reality by being mad about it. Like by all means be mad about it. Like I am very angry
Right.
about it. Like it is inequitable. But like, at the same time, I haven't yet to change inequity by being annoyed about it. I have only managed to outwit inequity. And so when I come to it from the thing of like, I know as a woman, as a European in a like kind of American dominated industry, that certain things are stacked against me, then I can be more deliberate about how I approach them, right? I just want to be clear. This doesn't mean by tearing other people down. I never want to tear other people down. But if I know what the risks are, then I can manage them better rather than being like, I want to live in an equitable world and then just like going for it and being like, oh no, I still don't live in an equitable world. Like who knew? Like we all know.
Yeah, I think there is a lot about one of the themes that I think we've just kind of that underscores a theme we've had here, which is like, you know, we have our beliefs, and then how do we work within these systems, and how do we begin to change the system underneath it, but how do we work within the systems for our best good and for our people's best good?
Yeah. I mean, this also comes to the topic of burnout, right? And often when people are feeling burnt out, it's because they're in values conflict, right?
Yeah.
And this is like one of the things with values, is that we believe that they are a moral good and a moral imperative. But you can have different values and come into a conflict that is not, in fact, a moral imperative conflict, right? Like you can be somebody who really believes in like forward motion and shipping, and you can encounter somebody who really believes in like correctness and QA, right? Now, this is a conflict that you can resolve and you can reach a balance between you, but you will never reach that balance if you come to it from like, this is a moral imperative, right? And
Right.
Yeah, and so this is something that I end up talking about a lot in coaching. Is like you are not your values. So you can uphold your values and exist in a system that is actually in conflict with your values. As long as you do not start saying, well, the problem is the conflict. If you're like, I believe, I don't know, in this industry, let's take a very common example. I believe the DEI is very important, but apparently it's not a business priority anymore. So I exist in the system and this is my value. It's like, it doesn't mean that you have to be miserable about it. You can just be like, this is my value. This is not the organization's value. I don't love it, but I accept it and I move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I wish we had more time. The book is really great. Everybody definitely go check it out. Thank you for joining us during the session. Please head over to the Bookmark Slack channel. I don't know why I'm pointing over here.
Slack is obviously over there.
It's obviously over there. But please head over to the Bookmark Slack channel where we'll be continuing the conversation with a Q&A for Cate. We'll be pausing on Bookmark for a while after today. We do love delivering these sessions for you, and we hope to be back sharing great books and even more incredible authors with you soon. Thanks again for being here, Cate.
Thanks for having me.